There is a particular ritual that the staff at Clarence House learned to set their watches by. Late morning, somewhere around 11, the Queen Mother would ring through with a phrase her household came to know by heart. Something to the effect of, "Is anyone there going to join me? Or am I going to have to drink alone?" It wasn't a question. By the time lunch was served, there had been gin and Dubonnet, 2 parts of the fortified wine to 1 part gin, the way she always had it. With lunch, red wine, particularly the heavy clarets she preferred. A glass of port occasionally, if the mood suited. Then in the evening, at 6 o'clock precisely, the daily reckoning. Her equerry, Major Colin Burgess, would hear a familiar enquiry. "Colin, are we at the magic hour?" A dry martini would follow, usually more than one. And with dinner, pink champagne, Veuve Clicquot specifically. By the accounts of her own household, she did this every day, from her late morning to after dinner, for decades, into her 100th year and beyond. Modern writers, working backwards from the documented sequence, have estimated the daily total at somewhere around 6 drinks at minimum, some putting it higher. The precise number is a calculation, not a record. The routine itself, though, isn't in dispute. Burgess documented it in his memoir, published in 2006. Peter Dorelli, a barman at the Savoy, independently recalled serving her gin-and-Dubonnet in the mornings and a dry martini in the evenings. The writer Nancy Mitford described a lunch party at which the Queen Mother had 2 dry martinis before the meal, wine with it, and port after, leaving the other guests exhausted trying to keep pace. At Clarence House, she hosted luncheons that, according to Difford's guide drawing on Burgess's account, routinely ended with guests passed out under the garden trees after failing to match what was described as her heroic consumption. The British public, who adored her as the smiling, stoic embodiment of wartime restraint and national continuity, who knew her, or believed they knew her, as the nation's grandmother, never had the faintest idea. The drinking habit was an open secret inside Clarence House and in certain corners of royal society. Outside them, it was invisible. She was 101 years old when she died on 30 March 2002, and the newspapers that covered her death devoted dozens of pages to her life without any serious mention of the thing that had structured every single day of it. The Mirror gave her 35 pages of tribute. The Sun gave her 27. The Times ran 8. None of them saw the glass in her hand. This is a story about a drinking habit. But underneath that, it's a story about how a habit this large, this regimented, this documented by the people who lived alongside it, managed to leave no public trace for the better part of a century. That gap isn't accidental. It tells you something specific about how the image of monarchy is constructed and maintained, and what a nation agrees to believe when it needs to believe it. Major Colin Burgess served as the Queen Mother's equerry for 2 years in the period between 1994 and her death in 2002. The Guardian described him, on the publication of his memoir, as one of the few people outside the royal family to have got to know her well. He was a former army officer, senior household staff rather than a footman, with daily access to her private schedule, her dining room, her garden, and her drinks cabinet. His book, Behind Palace Doors, published 4 years after her death, is the primary named insider account of the daily routine, and it's precise in a way that is worth taking seriously. The noon drink was the opening ritual. 2 parts Dubonnet, the French fortified wine, to 1 part gin, served consistently from late morning. The drink had acquired its own name in cocktail culture, the Queen Mother cocktail. Burgess documented her fondness for heavy clarets with lunch. Port after it, he noted, was only occasional. Very occasionally, in his own phrasing. Not the fixed, daily ritual it has sometimes become in the retelling. At 6 in the evening, the magic hour, the dry martini. "Colin, are we at the magic hour?" And then Veuve Clicquot with dinner. Not wine generically, but specifically pink champagne, 1 or 2 glasses. Burgess characterized her life, in one of his more memorable formulations, as following, A sedate routine, revolving largely around lunch and rather a lot of booze. He was also careful to add explicitly that she was nowhere near being an alcoholic. That framing, affectionate, normalizing, loyal even in revelation, tells you something about the staff culture that surrounded her. Even the man who documented the timetable in print didn't want to call it what a dispassionate clinician might. That isn't in itself a surprising position for someone who served her to take. But the phrasing is useful. It shows the register in which her drinking was understood by those closest to it. Not as a problem, not as a secret to be guarded, but as a feature of a life lived to the fullest, a constitutional eccentricity in someone of extraordinary constitution. It was softened into anecdotes, polished into charm, and from inside that register, no one had any reason to raise an alarm. There was a note, preserved and documented, that the Queen Mother sent to her page William Tallon before a picnic, instructing him to be sure to pack 2 bottles of Dubonnet and gin. The phrase, "in case it," trails off in the available record, but the purpose is clear enough. She arranged her supplies in advance. When her schedule required travel that didn't accommodate the usual ritual, Burgess recorded that she instructed staff to hide bottles of gin inside hat boxes, so she could have a discreet drink when circumstances didn't permit the usual form. The ritual wasn't negotiable. It was portable. The people who saw all of this, and who managed the logistics of it, kept it to themselves while she was alive. Burgess published his memoir in 2006. The book about William Tallon, Backstairs Billy, appeared in 2015. The wider pattern of insider accounts emerging after 2002 is real. The discretion that preceded those publications was structural rather than conspiratorial. Royal household staff signed formal confidentiality undertakings. Staff culture at that level operates on the understanding that what happens behind closed doors stays there. Not out of legal compulsion alone, but out of professional identity. Service, in that world, means silence. To understand why this mattered, to understand the weight of the gap between what was happening at Clarence House and what the public was told, you have to spend a moment with the image that was being protected. On 13 September 1940, a German bomber attacked Buckingham Palace while both the King and Queen were present. They were unharmed. That same afternoon, the King and Queen visited the East End of London. The visit was photographed. The photographs were distributed. The juxtaposition, the palace bombed, the royals immediately among the people who had been bombed first and hardest, was exactly the kind of moment that wartime image-making ran on. A line has been attributed to her from that period, one of her most quoted. Something to the effect that she was glad they had been bombed, because now they could look the East End in the face. No contemporary 1940 newspaper record has been found that quotes her with those exact words. The line is likely an accurate reflection of sentiment. Her letter to Queen Mary, written on Windsor Castle notepaper that same day, describes visiting the East End and finding the destruction deeply affecting. But the polished, quotable version is almost certainly a later refinement. This is how wartime mythology works. The real event is real. The memorable line is how the event was remembered, not necessarily what was said. What the historical record does confirm is that Elizabeth and George VI remained in London through the Blitz rather than evacuating, that they made repeated, publicized visits to bombed neighborhoods, and that the impression this created was both deliberate and lasting. The language used about her from the 1940s onward, courageous, steadfast, a symbol of morale, wasn't just editorial opinion. It was the product of careful image management, official photographs, distributed newsreel footage, and a press that understood its role in the project. By the 1960s, the language had shifted to grace and continuity. By the 1980s, it was the nation's grandmother. The image accumulated over decades. Hats, flowers, horses, racing, the warm wave at the crowd. Her fondness for a drink was occasionally mentioned in features by this period, but invariably with the affection one reserves for an endearing eccentricity, the implication being a fortifying gin at the end of a long day, not a structured daily timetable that ran from noon until after dinner. The two descriptions look similar on the surface. They aren't the same thing. The academic who wrote in a media studies text that she was more interested in her gin-and-Dubonnet than samples of, the phrase trailing into ellipsis, captured in a throwaway aside the quality of the cultural acknowledgement. Everyone knew. Nobody said it plainly. The Dubonnet and gin was charming, was her. The full timetable, the hat box, the magic hour, the insistence that guests keep pace, that stayed inside. The most instructive artifact of the whole concealment is a book published in 2009. William Shawcross wrote the authorized biography of the Queen Mother with complete access to her personal letters and diaries. The book ran past 1,000 pages. The Times called it totally absorbing and highly readable. The Daily Mail called it a colossal book about a colossal life. It was, by the standard of official royal biography, exactly what an authorized account is supposed to be. Reviewers outside the establishment consensus were less impressed. The Guardian found it indulgent, overlong, and ultimately unable to dispel the familiar picture. The London Review of Books characterized it as pious to a degree. A reader on Storygraph, navigating the book a decade later, noted that it glosses over the nasty things, naming her reported alcohol consumption specifically, then adding, almost apologetically, that having read up on it, she wasn't sure it counted as abuse. The Guardian review noted that Shawcross's treatment of her later decades reduced to the observation that one decade glided into another, a formulation that, in a 1,000-page book, amounts to a deliberate elision. This is what authorized omission looks like. Shawcross had access to everything. What emerged was a book that the people who already admired her found definitive, and the people who asked harder questions found insufficient. The drinking isn't confronted in the pages reviewers could cite. It's treated, if at all, as part of a life lived fully, not as a 50-year daily regimen documented in staff memoirs that preceded the biography by 3 years. Burgess published in 2006. Shawcross appeared in 2009. The authorized account came out knowing what the staff account had already told the world and chose a different emphasis. Lady Colin Campbell published her own account in 2012, claiming it as the untold story. Campbell is a different kind of source, an outside author whose credibility has been questioned by multiple critics and whose sourcing methodology isn't transparent. Her book touches on the drinking and on the Queen Mother's character, but the script of the authorized omission was already written by others before Campbell arrived. She is a third data point that corroborates a direction of travel, not a primary witness. What the gap between Burgess and Shawcross actually demonstrates isn't any individual failure of biography, but something more structural. Official accounts of royal lives serve a function. They aren't merely historical records. They are part of the image management machinery, operating even posthumously, even when the subject is no longer alive to require protection. The drinking is managed out of the 1,000-page authorized record in exactly the same way it was managed out of the public record for 50 years. Not through conspiracy, but through a culture that knew what it was doing and chose, very deliberately, not to do otherwise. The mechanics of the concealment are less dramatic than they might first appear. There was no D-notice. No formal palace press agreement specifically about her drinking has been documented. What there was, instead, was a system. Clarence House, from 1952 until her death in 2002, was her primary London residence. The drinking happened inside it, in the drawing rooms, the dining room, the garden hidden from the street, the private apartments. No photographer had a line of sight to any of these spaces. No journalist was admitted to the daily routine. The 1,000 and more photographs of her at Clarence House in the Getty Archive are exterior shots and formal occasions. The noon drink, the magic hour, the Veuve Clicquot, none of it was photographed. Not because it was hidden in any active sense, but because it occurred in rooms that no outsider entered without invitation. The staff who moved through those rooms were bound by what the royal household calls an undertaking of confidentiality, a document that asks signatories to agree not to disclose confidential information relating to their work. This isn't unique to royalty. Any major organization with a public reputation does the same. What is specific to the royal household is the cultural weight that sits on top of the legal obligation. Service, in that world, is a professional identity. Speaking publicly about what you saw is understood as a betrayal not just of contract, but of character. Burgess waited until she was 4 years dead before publishing. Talon waited 13 years. The press culture that might have compensated for all of this, the adversarial tabloid culture that would eventually pursue Diana with paparazzi at every turn, had, in the Queen Mother's case, no adversarial purchase. She was the mother of the reigning queen, the widow of George VI, the woman who had stood among the bombed streets of the East End. Tabloid attack requires a target who has done something the public wants to be indignant about. An elderly woman who happened to drink through the afternoon wasn't that target. Her drinking, when acknowledged at all, was framed affectionately as one of her charming traits. The Mirror wasn't going to run a front-page investigation into whether the nation's grandmother had a daily drinks timetable. The question didn't fit the story Britain was telling about her. There is a before and after moment in British royal press coverage, and it's Princess Diana. Before Diana, coverage of senior royals operated on a mixture of heightened interest, deference, and self-restraint. And then there was Diana, younger, glamorous, scandalous in ways that gave the tabloids adversarial material they could work with. The Queen Mother existed entirely in the before. She was widowed and elderly and performing the role of a harmless, warm figure who occasionally fell asleep in public and loved racehorses. That performance wasn't only believed, it was needed. And what a public needs to believe, it's very reluctant to be told otherwise. The result of all of this, the physical privacy of Clarence House, the contractual and cultural silence of staff, the deferential press, wasn't a cover-up. It was something more durable and harder to examine. It was a system in which no single actor made a deliberate decision to suppress the truth, and the truth nonetheless remained entirely suppressed. A habit this large, this daily, this documented in retrospect, left no public trace for 5 decades. The smiling photograph appeared. The drinks timetable didn't. Underneath the timetable, there is a behavioral record, and the connection between the two is the thing her former staff kept noticing without quite saying directly. When guests at her table ask for water, she would respond, "How can you not have wine with your meal?" attributed to Burgess in his account of her household. This wasn't a question with a safe answer. She presided over her table with an authority that made the social dynamic around drinking something other than a choice. Guests at her Clarence House luncheons who failed to keep pace found themselves outmatched by a woman in her 80s who had been maintaining this routine longer than most of them had been adults. The anecdote about luncheon guests passed out under the trees isn't a boast, or rather, it's a boast that tells you something about the environment she created. Drinking with her wasn't optional. It was the terms of engagement. To Queen Elizabeth II, at some point, she reportedly offered the dry observation that perhaps more wine wasn't wise. After all, one had to reign all afternoon. The attribution on this one is thin. It comes from drinks writing citing Difford's guide, not from a primary memoir. But it circulates because it captures something true about the character. The joke works because it applies the logic of her own daily consumption to someone else's situation. And the logic is entirely inverted. She was the one who drank through the afternoon, every afternoon. The irony was available to her because she had made it invisible to herself. What Burgess does not do, in the portions of his account available for examination, is explicitly connect the drinking to specific episodes of difficult behavior. That connection is an inference, not a documented claim, and the distinction matters. What he does provide is the full architecture of the schedule. A person who was gently, continuously drinking from noon onwards, who had been doing so for decades, who had never once in her adult life faced a consequence, or been told no in any domain of her existence. Staff accounts from multiple sources, the channel's own reporting, the book Yes, Ma'am, The Secret Life of Royal Servants, various memoirs, describe a pattern of sharp temper, cutting remarks, imperious demands delivered with that famous smile. The timing of these accounts relative to the drink schedule isn't precisely mapped in any one document. The connection has to be characterized, not asserted as causation. What can be said is this: the behavioral record and the drinking record describe the same person, across the same decades, observed by the same household staff. A woman who made every decision, received every form of deference, and faced no accountability, and who, on top of that underlying dynamic, was drinking from late morning to after dinner every day, is exactly the kind of person that those around her describe. Whether you attribute the temper to the alcohol, or to the decades of absolute deference, or to some compound of both, the staff saw what they saw, and they didn't say it publicly until she was dead. On the 9th February 2002, Princess Margaret died. She was 71. A stroke. The Queen Mother attended her younger daughter's funeral on the 15th February in a people carrier with blacked-out windows, shielded from the press in a wheelchair she didn't want photographed. She then retreated to Royal Lodge in Windsor. 49 days later, on the 30th of March 2002, the Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge. The official account described her as passing peacefully in her sleep. She was 101. Margaret's drinking was documented in its own right, across multiple biographies. The daily consumption, the decline in her later years, the way alcohol and cigarettes structured a life that ended at 71. It's a parallel record to her mother's, and the parallels are specific enough that writers and biographers have noted them explicitly. The same appetite, the same imperious quality, the same household that colluded in the habit by enabling it. Nature, environment, or some unreportable compound of both, the pattern ran in the same direction in both women. What is worth noting carefully, and without diagnosis, is that a 2025 biography of Princess Margaret suggested she may have had fetal alcohol syndrome connected to her mother's drinking during pregnancy. This claim sits at the edge of responsible speculation. It lacks any medical documentation and has been explicitly rejected by royal historians, and belongs in this account only as an illustration of how far the implications of the drinking timetable have been pushed in subsequent decades. The more documentable parallel is simpler. Two women in the same family, raised in the same environment, drinking in the same register, one of whom died at 71 and one of whom survived to 101. The difference in outcome between those two is one of the more interesting facts in this story. She had unreliable plumbing and central heating at Royal Lodge, which she preferred to any of the grander alternatives, and she seems to have enjoyed that. She made her final public appearance on 22 November 2001 at the recommissioning of HMS Ark Royal. She caught a cold at Christmas 2001 and never fully recovered. She died at 3:15 in the afternoon on 30th March 2002, with her daughter the Queen by her side. None of this, officially, had anything to do with alcohol. The medical reality of how anyone drinks daily for 5 decades and lives to 101 isn't straightforward. The research on long-term alcohol consumption and longevity is genuinely complicated. Not exculpatory, not condemnatory, but complicated. What the Queen Mother's case adds to that complication is the confounding variables that are inseparable from her class and circumstance. Excellent food, reliably excellent medical care, no financial stress, no occupational hazard, no poverty-linked health outcomes. A body that was, by the standards of what surrounded it, exceptionally well maintained in every respect except the drinking, or perhaps because of the structure the drinking provided, the social ritual of it, the purposefulness of the noon cocktail and the magic hour and the Veuve Clicquot. There are researchers who argue that structured, moderate to heavy drinking in older adults in conditions of high social engagement produces different outcomes than the same consumption in conditions of isolation and stress. Whether that explains anything about her specific case is unknowable. She died at 101, and left no medical record that attributed anything to alcohol. What she did leave was the documented timetable, Burgess's account, the note to William Talon about the picnic, the record of Dorelli serving her at the Savoy, Mitford's account of the exhausted lunch guests, her own question, "Colin, are we at the magic hour?" delivered with the regularity of a fixed appointment, every evening, for the years we have in direct testimony, and presumably for decades before. And then she died, and the newspapers cleared their pages. The Guardian ran a front-page column describing the deliberately archaic quality of the funeral service, noting the ancient power of the moment when the coffin was carried in. The Mirror devoted 35 pages to mourning. The Sun gave 27. The Times ran 8. Not one of them, in the coverage of the 10 days between her death and burial, engaged seriously with the thing that had structured every single day of her life. The obituaries described strength, dignity, laughter. The Telegraph's editor wrote about how the funeral had reunited the nation with its past. Jonathan Friedland, in The Guardian, described a ceremony that felt like an attempt to clasp history once more, for a few splendid hours. The habit wasn't in any of it. That, finally, is the real data point. Not the quantity, however you calculate it, but the totality of the concealment, confirmed by its own ending. She died, and the newspapers that had covered her life for 60 years wrote about a woman who was essentially sober. A woman who had stood firm through the Blitz. A woman of duty and grace and continuity. They wrote about the nation's grandmother, who was exactly that, and also exactly not that. And the two descriptions never collided in public print while she was alive. The staff who knew the truth published their accounts after she was gone. The authorized biographer, with access to a lifetime of private correspondence, produced a book that reviewers called indulgent and pious. The drinks themselves became a detail of cocktail history. The Queen Mother cocktail, 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin. Charming, nostalgic, entirely disconnected from the scale and discipline of the daily ritual it came from. She is sometimes quoted as saying she couldn't get through all her engagements without a little something to keep her going. The line is widely circulated. Its earliest traceable appearance in any retrievable source is a blog post from 2015, 13 years after her death. It may be genuine. It may be the kind of thing people said about her, polished by retelling into a first-person quote. The uncertainty is appropriate. Almost everything about her public image was constructed from the same material, a real event, or a real sentiment, refined by decades of careful framing into a version that served a particular need. Britain needed a sober, dutiful grandmother who had stood firm through the Blitz, smiling among the ruins, the antithesis of disillusion and self-indulgence. The gin was always 2 parts Dubonnet to 1 part gin, mixed at noon, every day, for the better part of a century. These two things coexisted without contradiction in the public imagination, because one of them was invisible. She lived to 101, and the nation that thought it knew her never saw a single glass. That, in the end, isn't a failure of journalism or a triumph of image management or a verdict on her character. It's a demonstration of something simpler and stranger. What a public needs to believe about its icons, it will believe. The most beloved woman in the country hid the most ordinary human weakness in plain sight. And the system that surrounded her, the Clarence House walls, the household confidentiality, the deferential press, the authorized biography, held the version together until there was no one left to hold it for. If you want more stories about the gap between what royals showed the world and what their household saw, subscribe. There are more to come.